The Galactic Empire, in its arrogance, believed itself unchallenged. 1,000 systems bowed to its will, its fleets painted the stars with conquest, and its doctrine declared the inferiority of all outside its genetic perfection. It did not conquer for necessity, it conquered for affirmation. And in its eyes, humanity was a statistical footnote. Primitive. Fractured. New to the galactic stage and late to the game. They were tolerated, for now, as one tolerates a curious animal, allowed to crawl among the stars with rusted ships and analog sensors. When human transmissions were intercepted, military archives, outdated training footage, documentaries, the Empire's analysts fed the data into the core AI for classification. Among them, a peculiar device caught their attention, a rotating, barrel-fed projectile weapon from humanity's industrial era. Obsolete. Inefficient. Loud. A joke. The analysts filed it under mechanical curiosities, and a senator of the inner ring laughed so hard at the footage that he ordered it replayed at a diplomatic gala, mocking the very idea that such crude machinery had ever been used in combat. He called it a musical instrument with bullets. The court laughed. The Empire always laughed. But beneath the derision, a memo was quietly passed through military channels, standard procedure. A summary of potential threats, negligible as they were. The device was described in brief technical terms: manually operated, multi-barrel, projectile-based, requiring kinetic ammunition and combustion. The analyst's conclusion read: no threat. Cannot penetrate standard shielding. No electronic signature. Zero compatibility with modern battlefield systems. And yet some among the Empire's hierarchy raised concerns, not because of the weapon, but because of its symbolism. These people had fought tooth and claw to suppress rebellion across the outer sectors. They had seen what desperation does to the lesser species. And Earth, in its short time among the stars, had shown patterns that unsettled the more cautious minds. It did not align. It did not assimilate. And it did not forget. When Earth refused to cede mineral rights on Gliese 442c, the Empire responded predictably. A single command cruiser, supported by orbital drones and a company of shock infantry. The message was simple: compliance, or consequences. No negotiation. The Empire did not beg. It imposed. And as the cruiser entered orbit, the Prime Executor transmitted a message to Earth's Planetary Council. Your defiance has been noted. Your extinction will be efficient. What the Executor expected was silence. Or perhaps a plea. What came instead was a transmission packet, unsecured, deliberate, slow. Inside, blueprints. The same weapon they had mocked. Labeled only with a single phrase in uppercase. We still remember how to bleed. The Executor dismissed it as bravado. More analysts were summoned, and simulations were run again. Always the same result: ineffective. Inferior. Laughable. The flaw wasn't in the analysis. It was in the assumption. For the Empire, war had become a process, remote, sanitized, algorithmic. They had forgotten the feel of recoil, the fear of steel, the madness of momentum. Humanity hadn't. It had spent millennia perfecting violence not as a tool of efficiency, but of terror. Earth had no interest in matching the Empire's elegance. It intended to rip through it. That irony, rich and bitter, would be lost on the Empire, until the day came when the sound of a rotating barrel meant not malfunction, but massacre. Until then, they would sit on their golden thrones, confident in their invincibility, blind to the truth that war was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to end things. They couldn't match the Empire's technology, and they knew it. Plasma-based rifles tore through polymer defenses. Orbital drones with predictive targeting left no room for maneuver. Electronic warfare was hopeless. Every network infiltration attempt ended before packets reached halfway. Shields rendered most energy weapons useless. Armor systems absorbed railgun fire like a breeze. Humanity had no equalizer, no angle of attack, nothing modern that stood even a fraction of a chance. That's when strategy shifted from progress to regression. It began in silence, underground, underfunded, and unsanctioned. Old defense contractors, retired ballistics experts, and military historians were pulled from obscurity. They weren't asked to innovate. They were told to dig. Dig into the archives of Earth's blood-soaked centuries. Not for guidance, but for weapons that worked without electronics, without reliance on fragile systems, without any vulnerability to digital interference. What emerged was not new. It was old in a way that defied expectation. A weapons system powered by combustion and steel. Rotating barrels. Kinetic ammunition. Chain-fed metal death that required no sensors, no firmware, and no permissions. It roared instead of beeped. Smoked instead of glowed. The ancient Gatling gun. They didn't copy it. They didn't modernize it either. They hybridized it. Coil-assisted spindles for faster RPM, armor-piercing slugs with magnetic cores, a rugged frame that could be field-stripped by hand in a dust storm. Ammunition production ramped up in hidden facilities. Factories once mothballed for obsolescence roared back to life. Brass casings poured down assembly lines by the millions. There was resistance within Earth's high command. It looked like desperation. That wasn't wrong. Desperation was now strategy. Because this wasn't about winning the tech race, it was about ignoring the race altogether. The Empire had trained its forces to react to energy signatures, to counter targeting lasers, to deploy adaptive shielding. None of those mattered when the threat wasn't digital. There was no warning. No precursors. Just a thunderclap and impact. Training programs shifted accordingly. Soldiers were retrained for mechanical upkeep instead of calibration protocols. Recoil management replaced neural syncing. They drilled until their hands could reload blindfolded. Oil and carbon replaced synthetic lubricant. Squads were taught to embrace chaos, to fight blind, deaf, and analog. When the first prototypes were fired, it wasn't a test. It was a warning. Underground bunkers vibrated. Engineers recoiled from the noise. Entire teams stood in silence after the barrels cooled, not because of awe, but recognition. This was power, not precision. Brutality, not balance. It was made for one thing: devastation. Soon, drop crafts were retrofitted. Drones were repurposed for delivery, not combat. Gatling guns were mounted in triplets, quad arrays, embedded in sandbag nests, atop tanks stripped of targeting systems. The weapon became central, not auxiliary. The simplicity became its shield. There was nothing to jam. No signals to intercept. Just a cycle of ignition, rotation, and death. They ran simulations, not with AI, but manually. Empire's shock troops versus high-density projectile streams. The projections were brutal. The bullets weren't stopped by shields because they weren't energy, they were mass. Unpredictable, fast, physical. Every impact wasn't just force, it was panic. The Empire hadn't prepared for psychological warfare. They prepared for equations, algorithms, precision. What they would face instead was chaos crafted by intent. Every soldier that trained with the weapon spoke the same truth. This wasn't about balance of power. This was about taking the Empire's playbook, burning it, and dragging the battlefield into a space where only one thing mattered: how long you could hold the trigger. There was no doctrine. No symmetry. Just thousands of rounds per minute, and the will to keep feeding the beast. The war wasn't going to be clean. But it was going to be loud. And very soon, the Empire would hear it. The Empire arrived without ceremony. No resistance was expected. Human colonies were known for their defiance, not their defense. This one, nestled on the edge of a resource-rich belt, had already been softened by orbital strikes. Forests burned. Communications were jammed. Civilian signals were silenced. The first drop squads landed on blackened soil with calibrated steps and active shields, ready to sweep the area and claim another example of Imperial dominance. The terrain was unfamiliar, ash-covered, cracked from suborbital heat. Scanners found no heat signatures, no life, no tech signals. The atmosphere was too quiet. Still, procedure dictated a sweep. Squads fanned out, moving in synchronous formations, plasma rifles tracking empty tree lanes. The first sound was dismissed as interference. A whine, low, metallic, rising. Not plasma discharge, not a drone, not anything catalogued. Just mechanical motion. Rhythmic. Continuous. Almost hungry. Then came the impact. 1 unit dropped. Then 2 more. Not energy wounds, puncture trauma. Penetration through armor designed for beam absorption. The rounds had mass, not light. They didn't vaporize. They shredded. By the time audio feeds picked up the full sequence, it was too late. The whine became a roar. Sustained, rotating, thunderous. Shell casings rained like brass hail. The nearest squad barely had time to activate shield sinks before their torsos were torn apart mid-command. There were no beam trails to trace. Just muzzle flashes. Dozens. Hundreds. Firing in perfect brutal harmony. Command ordered a fallback. But retreat paths were choked. The terrain had been shaped deliberately, funnels, kill zones, narrow alleys of natural terrain with no exit. Every opening was pre-sighted. Every angle led into fire. Troopers activated countermeasures, adaptive plates, personal dampeners, but the projectiles didn't care. The kinetic energy overwhelmed every system not built to handle sustained impact. Limbs tore. Visors cracked. Armor caved. Within minutes, over half the detachment was gone. The feed from the central command node flickered with static and blood. The last coherent transmission was a garbled phrase repeated over and over by a lieutenant whose helmet had been partially breached. They brought the old gods back. They made them real again. Those who survived the initial volley tried to regroup. They fell back to the drop ships, only to find the landing zones peppered with gun emplacements. No automation. No targeting AI. Just reinforced positions, manually operated, belt-fed, and manned by soldiers who weren't aiming, they were erasing. Escape became a myth. Orders broke down. Discipline collapsed. These weren't soldiers facing superior firepower. They were prey caught in a grinder. Empire tech officers couldn't make sense of it. The weapons had no network. No identification signals. No feedback loops. They weren't traceable. They were mechanical, analog, invisible to every system designed for modern war. The last dropship tried to lift. It got 20 feet off the ground before its side was split open midair by a focused burst. The weapon didn't disable, it destroyed. Shrapnel sprayed across the battlefield. The scream of stressed metal drowned under the endless spin of the barrels. Then silence. When reinforcements arrived 12 hours later, they found nothing salvageable. The terrain was littered with shredded armor, cratered bodies, and brass casings in numbers that defied logistics. The only remaining structure, untouched and deliberate, was a single steel crate embedded in the dirt. Painted crudely in red across the front were 5 words. "Still think it's funny?" The report submitted to Imperial Command excluded the word weapon. Instead, the analysts filed it under a new term: rotational mass exterminator. One admiral requested the footage sealed. Another requested it shown at every academy. The message was clear. Humanity hadn't upgraded. It had unburied something worse. News spread fast. Not through official channels, but through whispers, intercepted fragments, rogue broadcasts that Imperial censors couldn't scrub fast enough. An elite drop team had vanished. Entire squads gone without a distress signal. Autonomous systems rendered blind. Drones picked up nothing. No trace of EMPs. No sign of energy discharge. Only the aftermath, hundreds of shattered bodies and hills of discarded brass. Within hours, the incident was classified. High Command dismissed it as battlefield confusion. A glitch in shield harmonics. Rogue atmospheric interference. The official explanation didn't hold. Other species within the Imperial border noticed the silence, the sudden halt in expansion. Traders spoke of a human countermeasure unlike anything seen. Rumors turned to doctrine: avoid human territory, never land without overwhelming force, and never underestimate projectile death. The Empire responded with escalation. A new fleet was dispatched, shielded carriers, scout frigates, forward infantry with hardened armor and adaptive countermeasures. Their objective was not negotiation or diplomacy. It was correction. The assumption was that humanity had managed to fabricate some kind of high-powered artillery prototype, a last-ditch deterrent not capable of scale. They were wrong again. The second encounter began like the first: silent terrain, no EM output, no visible infrastructure. But this time, the terrain fought back with timing, coordination, and ferocity. Trees were hollowed and weaponized. Cliffs were reinforced fire nests. Trenches weren't defensive, they were feeders. The Gatling gun didn't act like a weapon. It behaved like a doctrine. The Empire's adaptive shields were calibrated for pulses. The rotating barrels bypassed this entirely. Projectiles didn't allow for heat prediction. They overwhelmed by mass. Every second of sustained fire introduced chaos into the Imperial network. Algorithms couldn't track the scatter. Each shot tore through not just armor, but morale. For the first time in centuries, elite soldiers broke rank. The sound became feared more than the bullets. The roar was mechanical, guttural, alive. The Empire had turned war into math, clean, predictable. The Gatling brought back panic, the kind that couldn't be patched. Every squad exposed to prolonged fire exhibited signs of stress detachment, hallucinations, sensory overload, command defiance. One of the surviving scouts described it without metaphor. He said it was like facing a storm that hated you. Other species were watching. The Krosh, long subjugated, began pulling back from Imperial contracts. The Velari refused patrol routes near human sectors. Even within the Empire, internal dissent grew. Senators questioned resource allocation. Why did a pre-FDL species now require full expeditionary deployments? Why were they not breaking? Why did they not fear annihilation? Because they never asked for survival. Humanity hadn't built to endure, they had built to punish. Planetary councils began rotating production into projectile munitions. Manufacturing centers worked non-stop forging barrels, shaping rounds, and shipping units by the ton. What should have been outdated industrial facilities became strategic pillars. The Empire tried targeting those factories. Every attempt ended the same: gunfire and loss. One Imperial captain noted the psychological component in his report. He wrote, "They are not hiding their weapons. They are showcasing them. Every casing left behind is a message." The message wasn't subtle. The Gatling gun became more than a weapon. It became folklore. Alien civilizations started referring to it by names of their own: the rotating reaper, the steel god, the hunger wheel. It appeared in underground music, graffiti, encrypted art. The most feared piece of hardware in the galaxy wasn't artificial intelligence or an antimatter warhead. It was a 19th century relic turned divine by human rage. And still, the Empire treated it as anomaly. They hadn't yet realized it wasn't Earth's secret weapon. It was Earth's new standard. The Empire's final offensive launched with overwhelming force. 6 carrier groups, fully mechanized divisions, planet-breaking artillery platforms, and orbital annihilation systems. Their orders were absolute: end the human threat, no diplomacy, no prisoners. They chose a symbolic target, a former industrial colony converted into a munitions hub. Destroying it would shatter morale, disrupt logistics, and reassert dominance. They expected resistance, but not victory. The scale of deployment was meant to crush, not compete. The first wave encountered no ships in orbit. No planetary defenses visible from scan. No energy fields. No countersignals. To the admirals, it confirmed human primitiveness. The orders continued: land, sweep, eliminate. They never touched the ground. As soon as the drop corridors opened, the sky lit up with streaking metal. Rail assist launchers, manual, analog, fired solid slugs from hidden planetary mass drivers. Not guided, not smart, just fast. The first carrier lost atmospheric control before deployment. The second ruptured in mid-descent, its lower decks shredded by tungsten storm. The third scattered its dropships prematurely, trying to preserve troops. They never regrouped. The surface below wasn't a city anymore. It was a labyrinth of kill zones. Every landing site had been prepared, pre-sighted, and calculated not for defense, but for maximum saturation. Infantry hit ground with orders in hand and were met by rotating barrels already spinning. Gatling arrays positioned with surgical intent ripped through formations before first contact was made. There were no warnings. No countdowns. Just fire. Relentless, grinding, deafening fire. Attempts to deploy aerial surveillance were countered not by hacking, but by steel nets and burst-fire flak systems. Human tactics refused to engage the Empire's strengths. Instead, they drowned them in volume. Command structures collapsed by the hour. Comms fractured. Coordinators dead. Automated systems fell out of sync when humans severed relay nodes with physical sabotage. Every fallback was trapped. Every retreat cut off. Troopers dug into craters for survival, not strategy. One Imperial general lasted 3 hours before calling for full orbital strike authorization. The request never reached Fleet Command. The relay satellites had been destroyed before the first boots hit dirt. It was not a battle. It was an execution written in brass. By the 4th day, Empire forces had lost 80% of ground strength. Supply routes were either jammed or pulverized. Evacuation orders went out too late. Human forces didn't chase. They didn't have to. The field was theirs. Empire survivors didn't speak of tactics or weaponry. They described sound, heat, vibration. Some never spoke again. Medics noted abnormal psychological trauma, patterns of silent pacing, sudden aggression, audio-triggered panic. PTSD had returned to a society that had long ago sanitized war. High Command buried the operation under redacted documents. No official memorial. No public debrief. But truth leaked. One by one, border worlds stopped flying Imperial banners. Former subjects began communicating directly with human envoys. Requests were made, not for technology, not for alliance, but for manufacturing rights to the weapon. Earth denied them all. The weapon was not for sale. Not to allies. Not to friends. It was a statement. Empires fall when they forget fear. And Earth had remembered how to teach it. Years later, historians would call it the deceleration. The point where Imperial expansion halted and never resumed. Maps froze. Territories held without growth. No peace treaties were signed. No official declarations made. But the galaxy shifted. In orbit over the ruined battlefield, a single human carrier deployed a payload, not explosive, not strategic. A monument. Steel, scorched silent. Embedded at its base, a simple engraved phrase. Progress failed. Rotating barrels did not. No one laughed again.